Hello everybody, and thanks for joining us at this Raise the Bar webinar. I'm Steve Smith and I'm one of the co-founders at Raise the Bar. I thought I'd give you a little bit of an insight, just a couple of minutes in terms of what Raise the Bar do before I hand over to Simon to talk about our resilience webinar today. We are one of the UK's leading learning development organisations, and we are passionate about inspiring individuals, teams and organisations to be the very, very best that they can be. We run talent programs, we run sales performance programs, staff engagement programs, skills workshops, and we work right across sectors. But what makes us a little bit different, and I think is a great way of differentiating us, is that we are also one of the UK's largest speaker bureaus, and we have access to over 400 of the most fantastic speakers who really act as the catalyst for a change in thinking to ensure that our programs make a lasting impression. They are the thinkers, doers, motivators and innovators that provide the platform for all of our programs. Now, we work across sectors, and it's brilliant to see that so many of our clients have joined us for today's webinar. And what I would encourage you to do is get involved. It's only 30 minutes, so grab yourself a brew, get a budgie, whatever you need to do, and on the left-hand side of your screen, there's going to be an area where you can ask some questions. So feel free to throw questions out there, and at the end of the session, Simon will come back to you on that. So resilience is a huge subject for many of our clients, lots of organisations, both individually and from an organisational perspective. Simon Shepard is an expert in that field. You might call him our thinker, doer, motivator, innovator. And he works with lots of different people from different walks of life. Today is a 30-minute taster to give you some tools and techniques to help you be more resilient and to perform at a consistently higher level. So I'm going to hand over to Simon. I'm going to go and get a green tea and some superfoods and enjoy the webinar from my laptop.
That's good from you, Steve. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Nothing like a bit of pressure to start with an introduction like that. Now, look, just while I can still see the whites of your eyes, I'd just like to ask you to ask yourself a couple of questions, if that's all right. You maybe don't have to stick your hand up in the air or nod vigorously or jump up and go, yeah, man. Just quietly reflect, but just if I ask a really simple question, are you interested in health and happiness? Yeah, I expect a few of you probably are. You're interested in doing well at work? Yeah. Again, we're probably close to 100%. And are you interested in having purpose away from work? And typically when I ask that question, the hands go up quite a lot quicker than the first two. I'll come back to that towards the end, but I'd just like to put that out there. Right, we're now going to start playing with technology and get some slides on the screen, because I'm going to do some talking and you're going to look at some pictures. So, today's topic, maximising resilience, it starts with you. I hope I'm going to make the case that it really does start with you. My name's Simon Shepard. Occasionally I have some initials after my name, that's MCSP. That means I'm a physio by background. So I've worked in a whole host of sectors. I've worked in the NHS, I've worked in private sector health, I've worked with businesses, and I've worked in sport. So this has been the office for about the last 25 years. That's Lord's Cricket Ground. It's a slightly unusual day because there's some blue sky, and I think one or two of the members are actually awake as opposed to fast asleep. And I started off looking after players in the home dressing room for Middlesex. I did that for about 11 years. And more recently, I spent time on the board there, and I'm in charge of the performance and health side of input into Middlesex and MCC. And this is the sort of site that greeted me some 25 years ago. It's a chap called David Boone, world-class international batsman. He batted number 3 for Australia, fag in one hand, beer in the other hand. I think he still holds the record for the most amount of beer that's drunk on a flight between Australia and London. That's something like 54 cans, which is quite incredible. And most people look at that picture and go, well, surely that's the Australians just celebrating another victory. That was probably the Australians warming up before the start of the play, because that's what it was like back in the day. And I do put those two pictures up there for a reason. See, if I think about cricket and what's changed in cricket in this picture on the left in 25 years, the answer actually is not a lot. You know, the essence of the game is still played by 11 people each side. The wicket's 22 yards long. They're 6 stumps. They're 4 bails. It tends to be boring from time to time. It often seems to attract the rain. But the nuts and bolts of the game are very, very similar. However, if I look at this picture here and think what has changed in cricketers, the input into these people is now absolutely phenomenal. whether it's about fitness, whether it's about mental agility, whether it's about tactics, whether it's about technique, whether it's about resilience. We don't call it resilience in sport. Most sports people can't cope with words of 4 syllables. We call it ready, or maybe readiness if they're really bright. But the input into these players is absolutely phenomenal now. And it's interesting to see that businesses and organisations are probably starting to realise that their people are important too. The last 25 years has seen an incredible increase in digitalisation, an incredible increase in demands on productivity. There used to be a saying 1 + 1 has to be greater than 2. I think we now got to the stage where most businesses are operating at 1 has to be greater than 2. And the problem is, if that 1 is gone, none can never be greater than 2. So we need to start looking after our people. Now, I'd like to say that businesses do this because they want to give you a cuddle and they think you're wonderful and they want to really nurture you and love you. I suspect actually most businesses do it because there's some numbers involved. And I thought I'd just start off by sort of setting the scene by just putting a few stories out there through the use of numbers. So story number 1 looks at old people. And if you look at this graph on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see that the life expectancy has increased quite dramatically over the last 60 years. There was a census done in the UK in the year 1911, and in that census, there were 64 people who were 100 years or older. Now that was repeated in 2011, 100 years later, and that number, it's a bigger number, that number had grown to 13,000. And the Office of National Statistics suggests that in some 100 years' time, some 25% of the population, or 20 million people in the UK, could live to the age of 100. And of course, with ageing lives, we're going to have an ageing workforce. Retirement ages are going to move from 60, 65, 70, 75, who knows where they will stop. But if people still become unwell at the same ages that they're coming unwell at the moment, the workforce is going to be an increasing burden on the employer. So old people and ageing is a very significant factor for businesses. The National Health Service has actually not become very good at health, but it's become incredibly good at medicine. It's become quite good at keeping people alive. We've still got the challenge of keeping people alive with great physical and mental functioning faculty. Story number 2 is around sick people. And I'd just like to model this. This was an organisation I worked with last year, and it was a big global bank that we worked with. We looked at their risk department. So it's a department of 6,256 people. The average wage in that risk department was $50,000. Their absence rate reported was 6%, which means that over $18.5 million a year has been lost simply by people not being at work. There's also this concept of presenteeism. Presenteeism is when people are turning up for work when they shouldn't be there, and that could be because they want to be seen to be there and end up working 15-hour days, or more typically it's because they're unwell and feel they should be there. And what happens when you're unwell and you turn up for work? You give everyone else your germs, so we spread infections, but also we make cock-ups. And that's why presenteeism is suggested that it costs businesses anywhere between 1 and 1.5 times the rate of absenteeism. So if I put that into the model for this organisation and their risk department, that's a further $28 million, creating a total of just under $50 million that are lost through absenteeism and presenteeism. So sick people is another story. The third story is around the bottom line, productivity, performance. Again, quite simply, if we can improve that by 10%, that's the equivalent of an extra 23 working days a year. Now, this organisation where the risk department was just over 6,000 people was an organisation that has 86,000 employees. So although if the risk department could increase its productivity by 10%, that would return $32 million to bottom line. If we looked across the organisation, and we did drop the average salary down a little bit here to $40,000, that equated to just under $360 million a year. So 3 stories there: ageing, sickness, or productivity and performance. And I think the numbers really do make a compelling case that looking after people is important. And there is one other number that I would like to put out there. And this is the number 91%. It was produced last year in a report called the Flux Report. And 91% was the answer of the number of HR directors who felt that resilience and the ability to deal with change was going to be the most important factor in employability in the next 5 years. Not what you know, not who you know, not when you know them, but the ability to deal with change. This concept of resilience. So what is this thing that we talk about? If we look at the dictionary, it might say in the physical terms, it's the ability of a substance or an object to spring back into shape. The capability to recover quickly from difficulties. Into a more modern parlance, bounce back ability. For me, resilience is actually performing at your best regardless of, well, pretty much regardless of whatever's thrown at you, whatever direction you've been pulled in, however far you've fallen, you can get back up quickly. There's possibly a slight difference between resilience and robustness, and this is a concept that's just starting to come in, that many people are quite resilient. There are other people who are very robust. They're the ones who don't get knocked down. What often happens though is those who are very, very robust, when they do get knocked down, it takes them an awful long time to recover. So actually the golden ticket is resilience and robustness. One of the things I do want to point out about resilience is it's a two-way street. So I just want to tell you the story of the glass of water. Because we always think that the world is changing around us at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And it's always the world that's changing. And that's the issue here. Now, I have got a couple of children. My youngest son, he's 15 now, so he's got out of this habit. But he went through a stage when he was growing up that, at dinner, he'd often spill his glass of water. And most evenings I'd be absolutely fine. I'd go, don't worry, son, that's not a problem. No trouble at all. Let's just go and get you a fresh glass. Let's mop that up. Let's all sit down and have a lovely family dinner. Yet on occasion, at the same time, in the same place, with the same people, exactly the same thing would happen. But my reaction was maybe not the same. The only thing that has changed there has been myself. In fact, we are often the most dynamic thing in the equation. So understanding where we are is absolutely important. It is absolutely vital when we're considering this topic of resilience. The thing that challenges our resilience is not the spilling of the glass of water, but is often an accumulation of this thing, stress, this thing that's sweeping the modern world, this thing that's almost become the bragging rights in some offices. Your stress can be nowhere near as big as my stress. My stress is the biggest thing that you can ever imagine. Crazy, huh? But what is stress? And if I ask audiences this, typically I get all sorts of responses, sort of a psychophysiological response. There are hormones involved. There's adrenaline, cortisol, fear, fight, flight. It's not pressure, it's more than pressure. There's eustress, there's distress. We sort of go all over the place, don't we? So I'm going to suggest that we just try and keep things really, really simple. So for me, stress is a response to load. We can have good responses, we can have bad responses, we can have in the middle responses. And some of you may remember doing this sort of experiment at school where you dangled weights on a spring and you observed what happened to that spring. And every time you put a weight on, you get the ruler out and you measured the length of the spring. And you ended up drawing a graph. And that graph is called a stress-strain curve. And I think human beings are very similar to this model. They're not identical, but they are very similar in the fact that they either stay stable, they're stretched, or they break. And that break could be in performance, or in health, or in both. Of course, unlike the spring, human beings have loads thrown them in lots of different directions. And there's also a temporal component. How long are we exposed to that load? There's a learning component. How have we learned how to deal with those loads? But there are just a few silos from physical load, mental load, this juggling act that is life these days between work and home. The environment, emotional loads, toxic loads, things like cigarettes, alcohol, drugs, and then disease. And there may well be other silos. But it's worth actually just trying to understand which are the things that are really putting load through your system. Now, there are one or two models that sort of look at the interaction of load and stress, and typically we consider sort of this Yerkes-Dodson model where performance increases with a degree of stress. There's a chap called Andrew May in Australia. He uses the word chill, thrill, spill, kill, which I quite like. But there's quite a fine tipping point at the top between that perfect level of performance, the demand on our system that gives us that great output. I quite like a really simple model because I think life is a bit of a balancing act. And so let's look at this balancing triangle, where on the left we've got coping, on the right we've got load. And of course, if the load becomes excessive, you can see where that arrow goes. The trouble is, the loads are the things that are very hard for us to actually determine. You know, the northern line is going to be the northern line. How many times my phone rings today is really not in my hands, unless I turn my phone off, of course. The number of emails I receive is down to people sending them to me. And yet we often get bogged down in the loads. So what I'm going to suggest is we really need to get bogged down on the left-hand side, which is around the coping strategies. How are you coping with life? Because the coping is probably something that's very much more in your hands, and therefore you can tip the scales in your favor. I think one of the best ways to actually cope is to be energized. A chap called Jim Lowe, who wrote The Corporate Athlete, managing energy is the single most important factor in sustaining high performance. And of course, the more energized we are, the more likely we are to achieve a few of these things. We tend to be healthier, happier, have greater vitality, pizzazz, vim and vigor. We tend to be more resilient, engaged, productive, and committed. When I'm talking about engaged, productivity, and commitment, I'm actually thinking with ourselves. We're more engaged with ourselves, we're more productive for ourselves, and we're more committed to ourselves, which I think can be summarized by being purposeful. That's purposeful in everything, like at work and away from it. So we've had a bit of theory, we've thrown a few models out there, and we often talk to be quite new. That's something that's really quite hard to get objective data on. So I actually spend quite a lot of time measuring these things and trying to get objective data. And the heart really does provide us quite a nice window to look and see how the body is working. And in the background of sport, people will be familiar with heart rate monitoring. I mean, all these folks playing ice hockey here have been monitored. All their data is going onto the screen here. The support staff can see exactly whose backsides to kick and who just to say, just calm down. And the recipe is dictated. And that's the recipe on load. But the factor is, these people, whether they're footballers, ice hockey players, rugby players, they probably only train and play for around about 20 hours a week. And it strikes me that there are another 148 hours in the week. And it's actually how we live this life that probably influences a heck of a lot of the data that we're collecting in the 20 hours that we're monitoring. So what we do is we try and monitor for a little longer, and we, in particular, we don't just look at heart rate, but we look at something called RR interval. And this is the pattern of the heart rate. So if I've got a heart rate of 60, I'm making that up, but I'm sitting here, I've got a heart rate of 60, I'm quite stressed, I don't know how many people have nodded off, how many people have logged off, how many people have played airplanes at the screen, etc. But I'm in a state of sympathetic dominance, I'm releasing the hormones adrenaline and cortisol. My blood pressure will be slightly raised, I'm sweating a little bit more. But my heart will be beating like a metronome, 1 beat a second. Maybe later on I'll be really relaxed, everything's gone really well. I've been in a state of what we call parasympathetic dominance. My blood pressure will be slightly lower now. My digestive system will be working again because blood's now returning to that area. And my heart will be beating quickly for 5 or 10 seconds and then slowly for 5 or 10 seconds. Quickly for 5 or 10 seconds and then slowly for 5 or 10 seconds. I've still got a heart rate of 60, but the pattern is totally different. And that pattern is being dictated by our autonomic nervous system. So in sympathetic stages, we can see blood pressure increases, sweat increases, digestion decreases, and the pattern of our heart rate is metronomic. In a parasympathetic state, our blood pressure decreases, sweat decreases, digestion increases, and we show some variance in the heart rate pattern. So we monitor this over a long period of time. Typically, we look for at least 3 days of people, and we use a monitor called a bodyguard monitor. And whilst people are wearing that monitor, they keep an online diary through their phone. And then we match behaviors and context against physiological response. And I thought it would just be quite interesting to have a look at sort of 3 or 4 examples, just to see some of the outputs and where people get certain things right and where people get certain things wrong. So what that monitor collects is the interval between the heart rate and the pattern. It collects it every thousandth of a second. It produces a whole long list of numbers, and then we turn it into pretty pictures. So here's a pretty picture, and this looks at a city trader. The red-brown color is when this person is loaded. Some use the word stress, I prefer to use the word load. They're in that state of sympathetic dominance, their heart's beating like a metronome. So very typical during the working day. This dark blue here, this is when the person is exercising and went to the gym. So we've got physical load here, non-physical load here. They've gone to bed just before midnight. They've gone straight then into parasympathetic dominance, where that heart rate is showing more of a variance pattern. Okay, that looks fantastic. If I sleep like that tonight, I'll be a happy bunny. This is the same person the very next day. So again, a 24-hour trace. But you can see the only recovery they get is between 5:30 and 6:30 in the morning. They didn't go to bed here. They actually went to bed at exactly the same time as the night before and was asleep. So although they're resting, they're not restoring. And there's a big difference between rest and restoration. This is a really obvious example. On this evening, the trader took clients out for dinner, ate late and drank 2/3 of a bottle of wine, or that's what they owned up to. So they got to deal with the toxicity of the alcohol, they then got to digest the food, and you've had mental engagement all day and in the evening. From this data, we then draw a resilience line. So on day one, this person's batteries drop down. That line goes down when in the red-brown color, and it goes down as a gradient that is in proportion to the physiological response. It then recharges effectively. So you can see this is a pretty balanced day. On day two, the batteries go down again. They do it for all of us. We're tired, that's why we go to bed. So see that the recharge was ineffective. And I think most of you can relate to leadership, to thinking, to communication, to body language. This is a consistent feature. So that's a very obvious example. This is probably something that we see a little bit more often. This is what I call the dripping tap. So this is a 72-hour monitor trace here. So you can see on the Monday, the batteries have gone down, and after 24 hours, they're just down a bit. Tuesday, they're down a bit more. Wednesday, they're down a bit more. And I think you can imagine where this is going to go come Friday. But that's fine, we've got the weekend now. We'll all be all right. The trouble is the first 20,000 days of data that we've looked at, the toughest day of the week is Saturday. So sometimes when we have the opportunities to recover and restore, we don't always take them. Here's an example of shift working. So I know that some of the attendees to the webinar today will work with organisations where shift working is prevalent. This looks at nursing, so you can see an early shift, the shift is here. The nurse has slept from here through to here, and that's really fantastic recovery. The late shift, the shift is from here through to here. Bedtime was here. This is around about 11:30, 12 o'clock, and it's not until 3 o'clock in the morning that the recovery is kicking in. And then this is the night shift. So this is the shift period here, but there's not 1 minute where there's actually a little bit of recovery there. There's hardly any recovery over a 24-hour period. Now, night shifts have to happen. We can't stop night shifts. But I think we should also not put our heads in the sand and pretend that they're not particularly good for our health unless we coach people and train people how to be more resilient and how to create an environment that allows them to recover fully. These people have about a 4-year decreased life expectancy. Maybe this is one of the reasons why their cells are never getting that opportunity to recover. Travel. This is a 26-hour journey to Australia, 12 hours sleep on that flight, no alcohol on that flight. The person got off that flight and said they slept incredibly well. There wasn't 1 minute recovery. Night one, still no recovery. Night two in Australia, it kicked in. So again, we use the technology to help people understand when they should start making decisions, when they should start those big meetings. Should we start a big meeting here when we've been in that red-brown color for about 48 hours? Probably not the best thing. We also use the technology to help people, design strategies for people that makes this become night one. And in sport, we use this quite a bit to try and help people understand when they should start training after long journeys. Couple more. This is a person on the board of one of the banks that went into trouble 5 or 6 years ago. Now, he came to see me with back pain. I'm a physio after all, and he told me about his back for 20 seconds, and he told me about his life for 20 minutes. So I got option A there, sort of push his back around, go click, 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 telling him to bend his knees when he lifts, maybe strengthen his abdominal and gluteus medius muscles. Or option B, we could actually have a look at what's going on in his life. So we put a monitor on him, and there we go. Hard exercise for him at Ballard. an hour and a quarter just before bedtime. I thought, aye, this is going to be interesting. Anyway, he came in and we were talking about it. He said, well, actually, I'm exercising there because exercise is good for me. Huh? I've read all this stuff, exercise is good. And I've gone out and I've bought this punch bag. You could almost imagine him going back from the bank in total frustration, putting the theme music to Rocky on in the background and just punch, 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 punch. So it's a way of dealing with my stress. The trouble is that hard exercise at the wrong time is not great. Hard exercise is a stimulant. So if we do that last thing at night, you can see what happens to the sleep. So we stopped him doing that, his back got better. Bank still collapsed, but his back got better. Last one. This is, I think, a really important slide. It looks at people's perceptions. This is a cancer nurse who once a week has to do a really tough clinic. Her perception is that's going to be the toughest time of my week. My perception was that's going to be the most stressful time of your week. That was her doing the clinic. And it's really interesting monitoring people is that how often we see when people are doing functions that are really closely aligned with their values, really closely match their training and skill sets, have been delivered in an environment in a way that is organized, efficient, thorough, and purposeful, we will see it physiologically. What is also interesting about this slide is looking at the data overnight. And when we talked to this nurse, she said, well, actually, I'm also worried about getting my PhD in 6 weeks' time. Great, great, great. Let's cut to the chase here. What you thought was a problem, you're absolutely great at. Walk into work 2 inches taller next week. Let's look at some strategies to help you with something that you probably wouldn't even have thought of unless you'd had some data to take you there. So maybe one of my challenges to everyone is that we need to look in the mirror with depth occasionally. Often we're very good at looking in the mirror and seeing what we want to see, or looking in the mirror and seeing what we think other people want us to see. But we don't always have that depth of look. Sometimes we just skim the surface. You see, people are interesting. Another tool we often use is a little energy and performance profiler. It's about 80 questions. And one of the questions in there is, I feel a sense of achievement when I reach my personal goals. This was some data from a group of around about 450 people. We did this within an organisation last year. Well, 96% of them came back and said strongly, yes, I do feel a sense of achievement when I reach my personal goals. What's interesting is the next question says, I set goals and revisit these regularly. We've dropped off a bit. So often we know things, but we then don't execute things. And the data helps us sort of break into people's mindsets a little bit. So when people wear the monitors, one of the questions we ask them before they wear them is, do you feel you sleep enough? Well, in this case, the majority of people didn't think they slept enough. Actually, most people did. This is a group of around about 200 people in the bank. If we reframe the question, I feel rested and energetic, we're starting to get a slightly closer alignment between what people thought, their subjective feelings, and what people were showing physiologically. It isn't a perfect alignment, but we're getting closer. So it's also pretty important to frame questions when we're asking people about resilience. In terms of exercise, I think I'm physically active enough to get health benefits. This was a group of about 200 people in the NHS. 51% felt they were. Well, in fact, the average was only 15 minutes a day. And it's about health promotion, not fitness, but just doing enough to be healthy, which I guess most people want to be. So data also helps us break into perceptions and whether they're accurate or inaccurate. So we've got some models, we've got some data. I'm just going to very quickly touch on what I call the KHPIs, key human performance indicators. So once we've got the data and we've taught people about the theory, we hope to give them a bit of a toolkit. So there are 7 pillars of resilience, or 7 pillars of performance, or 7 pillars of well-being. I don't mind what the wrapping paper is. P is around psychology, positive thinking. E is the environment. R is about rest, recuperation, and recovery. F is fuel, what we put in our mouth. O is organization. R is responsibility, relationships, and values. And M is movement. And obviously in this little taster session, there's not enough time to really talk through all of these. In fact, I'm just going to just very quickly touch on one of them, and that's going to be this one here, responsibility, relationships, and values. You see, so many organizations are putting a lot of effort into into creating value statements these days. They sort of underpin vision, mission, that pathway to success. You know, here are just a few value statements. So respect, safety, excellence, courage, one team. That's BP. Pride, achievement, respect, innovation, care. That's Imperial Health Trust. Respect, integrity, service, excellence, stewardship, Barclays. Authenticity, integrity, performance, unity. I suspect all of you can recognize that. That one's FIFA. You see, the trouble with value statements is sometimes there are just these incredibly bold, ambitious words that we use, and the slightest chink in the armor can lead to downfall. So I'd like to have a little think about the thing that sits between values and vision, mission, success. And for me, that's people and culture. Does this sort of thing work? Just to wrap up, well, we seem to be getting some pretty good results. Here's an individual. This was a head of a risk team in a bank, and this was the data when we first monitored them. So you can see there's hardly any recovery, and their energy line, resilience line, was in strong negative territory. We had a chat with this person, and actually this was a really easy one. They said, well, I love exercising. I said, well, why don't you exercise? They said, I just don't have enough time. And I said, well, look, come on. You're not going to have enough time every day, but it's realistic to do two or three sets of exercise a week, is it? And they thought for about 30 seconds, and the nod of the head kicked in, and yeah, it probably is actually. Well, this was their data 6 weeks later. So it's great that they're exercising, but what was just as important, it was great that they were doing something that they loved. That was the word. I love exercising. I'm not doing it. So they're now starting to be responsible to themselves around the things. Here's a group. So this is a leadership group. This was their data at the beginning of the program that we ran for them. So the percentage of the 24-hour period in that loaded state was 55%. The percentage of the 24-hour period in that recovery state, 19%. We produce a sleep index that runs between minus 100 and plus 100. The average across the group was -1, and the percentage of data and resilience achieved was about as good as a flip of a coin at 50%. We sort of say yes or no on that, depending on whether your line has got back to where you started on that battery graph. This is 4 months later after a bit of coaching, a couple of workshops, and some monitoring. Stress had hardly changed. It doesn't. The loads that go through our system are probably going to be similar today as they are tomorrow. But what had changed enormously was the coping. So lastly, just to wrap up, some questions, if I may. I'd like you to ask, how energized are you? How often do you ask yourself that? I sort of probably thrown a few things out there to make you think of how you're being stressed, but how do you stress others? What happens to them? And I guess, what happens to us? Some final thoughts. Recognize where you're at. Without recognition, very little else can happen. You need to stop and think occasionally. Understand where you're at, understand why you're there, and then put in place a strategy to help. Recharge efficiently. If we don't sleep well, if we don't recharge effectively, we're going to run into problems. And lastly, as an organization, respire effectively. So for me, the culture and your people are your respiratory system. They are the breathing life within your organization, and they are the thing that will influence organizational resilience on a daily basis. I guess what I've said is none of it's rocket science, really. You know, people often go for those marginal gains, those extra 1%. I'm not sure I've given you those, but hopefully what I have done is given you some foundation stones. And in organizations, you need strong foundation stones. So do learn, do try, do evaluate, maybe do it again, maybe modify, and keep doing. The changes are simple, but they're not always simple to execute. And one last question. You know that one I asked at the beginning? Who's interested in health and happiness, and who's interested in doing well at work, and who's interested in having a purposeful life away from work? And I suspect you all went yes to all of those. I always get that wrong. Always get that wrong. What I should have asked, of course, is who's committed? And I think that's it. So thank you for listening, everyone.